Section M, the farmers take their stand. So in the last video we were talking about the fact that farmers were very independent, very individualistic, so it was really hard for them to start forming cooperatives, start forming unions in effect, because they're by their nature very independent. So this section talks about really the first attempts farmers make at organizing. Kind of the first major attempt we see is an organization called the National Grange of the Patrons of Husbandry, also known as, or more famously known as, just the Grange. The Grange was organized starting in 1867. It was founded by a Minnesota farmer by the name of Oliver H. Kelly. And Oliver H. Kelly, it really wasn't a political thing, it was just a means to get farmers to socialize. A lot of farmers were very isolated and just hungry for any social interactions. So the Grange would organize, a picnic or a concert or a lecture, that sort of thing. But soon over time, people are meeting together in social atmospheres. They start to cooperate kind of naturally. So out of the Grange movement, we also see the establishment of co-ops or cooperatives. So instead of paying through the nose at the local mercantile for a pair of shoes, people would work together, and kind of the co-op would own the store to kind of regulate the prices. Same thing with, grain elevators. Instead of, paying through the nose at the grain elevator, they would kind of work together, build their own grain elevator. So we see co-ops forming through the Grange movement. And, the Grange movement did step into politics a little bit towards the end, especially in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Iowa. We see a lot of Grange laws being passed at the state level. And these laws were trying to regulate railroads, trying to regulate the rates for grain storage, that sort of thing. The problem was a lot of these Grange laws were badly written, so they really didn't hold up in court very well. One of the most famous Grange laws that was shot down was that famous Wabash case we looked at a couple chapters ago. The Wabash case, more or less, it was a Supreme Court decision that more or less said states do not have the right to regulate the railroads because the railroads go through more than one state. That means they fall under the jurisdiction of the Congress, because Congress is the one that gets to regulate interstate trade. So after this Wabash case, we really see the Grange, at least on a political level, really kind of fading away. Another small political party that's formed at this time is the Greenback Labor Party. Think of a greenback meaning paper currency. This Labor Party, their platform, what they were running for, is really they wanted inflation. Okay, inflation through the printing of more and more greenbacks. They did gain some political traction in 1876. They had 14 members elected to Congress. So we do see the farmers, kind of this section is in its infancy trying to organize for their betterment. All right, section N, prelude to populism. All right, so the first kind of movement for farmers to organize was the Grange movement, and now we see something growing up out of Texas, and this is called the Farmers Alliance. The Farmers Alliance was at first formed to kind of help farmers flee the grip of the railroads. The railroads dictated so much to farmers, especially the rate at which they could sell their goods. So the Farmers Alliance was kind of a co-op created to, like I said, combat the railroads. And let's just talk about it a little bit. The first 20 years, they gained about 1 million members, but really their weakness is they only allow landholders to join their organization. So if you were a tenant farmer, a sharecropper, a farm laborer, you're not allowed to join the Farmers Alliance. And also, especially in the South, the Farmers Alliance didn't welcome African Americans. So African Americans kind of created their own alliance called the Colored Farmers National Alliance. But they boasted about, 250,000 farmers. So why we really care about the Farmers Alliance is because kind of out of the Farmers Alliance, we see a political party forming called the Populist Party or the People's Party. We see the Farmers Alliance being kind of the direct successor to this Populist Party. And the platform for the Populist Party was, attacking Wall Street. They wanted to nationalize the railroads. They wanted to nationalize the telephone, the telegraph. They want a graduated income tax, which means if you make a lot of money, you make more, you pay more in taxes. They also wanted a program where farmers could get, inexpensive loans from the federal government as well. But more than anything, they really, really wanted inflation, because inflation helps farmers, because farmers are always in debt, at least it would appear. So they wanted inflation through the unlimited coinage of silver, and we'll be talking about that a little bit later. Some popular populists you might want to know. We have William Harvey. William Harvey writes a pamphlet entitled Coins Financial School. This pamphlet is published in 1894, and it really kind of promotes the idea of free silver. We have a famous congressman who is a populist. His name is Ignatius Donnelly. He's from Minnesota and is elected to Congress 3 different times by the Populist Party. And also Mary Elizabeth. She is known as the Kansas Pythoness, like a python, but like a girl, Pythoness. And she is kind of a hellraiser. And she says she wants Kansas. She says Kansas should raise less corn and more hell. So she was a go-getter for the Populist Party in Kansas. And it's really people out east were so over it. They were so sick and tired of hearing these Western farmers complain all of the time. One Easterner at this time was quoted saying, "I don't want any more states until we can finally civilize Kansas." So they're like so over all of this racket from the West. And, of course, the Populist Party, when they start to gain political traction, it really kind of unnerves the Republicans and the Democrats. They don't want to lose any members to this Populist Party. We see in 1892, the Populist Party gains several seats in Congress. When they run a presidential candidate, they get over 1 million votes, that sort of thing. And the hope here is really that the populists, they're usually farmers, right? Think of like a kernel of popcorn, popping corn, farmers, Populist Party. Populists are kind of like the disgruntled farmers. Their hope was that the farmers who are unhappy with their lot in life could join forces with these labor unions who are unhappy with their lot in life, and really together they could go and they could, bring down the really wealthy folks in the East. All right, section O, Coxey's Army and the Pullman Strike. So we're looking at 2 different things in this section. Let's start with Coxey's Army. So there's a financial panic in 1893, which leads to depression. Okay, depression leads to unemployment. So there's a lot of unemployed workers just hanging out, upset about their lot in life. A lot of farmers and workers both really felt like they were victims. So some unemployed workers, would protest the system. They would go on these marches to protest. The most famous march happens in 94. We see a man by the name of Jacob Coxey, known as General Jacob Coxey. He owns a quarry from Ohio. So he starts out in Ohio in 94 with about 100 unemployed, disgruntled workers. And he marches to Washington, and his demand is this. He wants to see the federal government issue $500 million in legal tender, so paper money, and he wants that to serve 2 purposes. One, if you issue $500 million in paper currency, that's going to lead to inflation. But 2, he also wants the government to spend this $500 million by hiring unemployed workers, and he wants the unemployed workers then to work on public works like improving the roads, building bridges, that sort of thing. Unfortunately, what happens is, Coxey's army shows up to Washington in 94. By now they had gained some members, so there's about 500 of them, but they are arrested because they walked on the grass. All right, so Coxey's army really doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't really change anything, but it's kind of showing, this populist movement is growing a little bit. Interesting fact, Coxey actually names his son legal tender. Crazy. All right, Pullman strike. Let's talk about that. So the Pullman strike also happens in '94, the same year Coxey's army's marching into D.C. And you may have remembered talking about the Pullman Palace car. That was like the very luxurious train car with the swinging kerosene lamps that often caught on fire. Well, anyway, the Pullman Palace Car Company was not doing so hot because of this depression. So they decided to lower their wages or cut the wages of their workers by a third. That's not fun. But also at the same time, a lot of these workers are living in kind of the Pullman company town. And the company town means that you're paying rent to the Pullman company. So at the same time, they're cutting their rate of the wage. They're cutting their wage for the workers. They're also not cutting the rate they're asking for rent. So there's a lot of unhappy people in the Pullman company. What happens is a man by the name of Eugene V. Debs goes in and starts to organize this labor movement or this union, and he calls it the American Railroad Union. He gains about 150,000 members. And so Debs organizes this American Railroad Union, and more or less they go on strike, and it more or less stops all railroad traffic between Chicago and California. The American Federation of Labor, we talked about that before, decides not to join in the strike because they think the strike is a little beneath them because some of these railroad workers are destroying property, knocking over railroad cars, that sort of thing. But really, like on a state level, the governor of Illinois, his name is John Altgeld. He really didn't do anything. He's always been kind of a friend to the unions. He was the governor who had pardoned some of those Haymarket Square rioters that had been arrested. So at the state level in Illinois, the governor really didn't do anything. He thought it really wasn't out of hand yet. However, on the federal level, they weren't going to take this strike. The Attorney General, just so you know, is kind of like the lawyer of the United States. His name at this time was Richard Olney, and he dispatches federal troops to stop this strike. And his excuse is that the strike is interfering with the U.S. mail. So he's like, this is a federal offense. You're messing with the mail. And also President Cleveland, he also supports this decision to send in federal troops. Same reason, because of the mail, of course. And his quote is this: "If it takes the entire Army and Navy to deliver a postcard in Chicago, that card will be delivered." Ooh. So what happens is this is the first time the courts get involved in strikes. So the courts actually put forth an injunction saying that you have to stop this strike. And of course all the strikers ignore this court injunction. So when the federal troops go in and break up the strike, they arrest a lot of strikers by saying they're in contempt of court because they're going against this court demand or injunction saying they had to stop the strike. And because they're in contempt of court, that means they don't get a jury trial. Not a happy thing. So Debs, the leader of the union, was thrown in jail for 6 months. But we really see, farmers and laborers really get upset about this strike, not just because they use federal troops, we've seen that before, but because it's now the courts are getting involved. The courts are putting this injunction up saying, hey, you have to obey what we say. So it's really like they take offense because it's like the business, the federal government, and now the courts are all ganging up against the workers, and we're not happy. They're not happy about it at all. All right, section P, Golden McKinley and Silver Bryan. This is talking about a really big presidential election, the presidential election of 1896. And we really see the biggest issue coming forth in the 96 election is the idea, are we going to keep the gold standard, or are we going to inflate currency by coining silver as well? All right, so let's start with the Republicans. The Republicans decide to nominate McKinley, William McKinley. He had a beautiful resume. He had gotten national attention through helping to pass the McKinley Tariff in 1890. Also, he's from the swing state of Ohio. So we see at this time a lot of times people would nominate folks from Ohio to be president, because if it came down to the swing state of Ohio, if Ohio got to determine who's president, who's not, a lot of times Ohioans would vote from people from their state. So we see he's from Ohio, which was a gold star at this time. Also, he was a major in the Civil War, and he was known for his work in the Civil War, and he had been in Congress for a long time. But with McKinley, we have to know with this election, the person who's really behind McKinley, person who really pushes McKinley to run, is a man by the name of Marcus Alonzo Hanna. He's just known as Mark Hanna. Mark Hanna was a senator from Ohio, and he really finances McKinley's campaign and also really runs it for him. And Hanna's philosophy of government is this. He believes that the primary role of government should be to aid businesses. That's his motto, okay? So his idea is this trickle-down economics. You know, what's good for business is good for America. If businesses are flourishing, that means employers workers will get jobs, they'll spend money, and money is good for the economy, that sort of thing. So that was his idea. And the Republicans, in turn, also their platform was very much pro keeping the gold standard. We see a lot of people in the East really liking that. So for Democrats, let's talk about the Democrats now. Cleveland was president at this time, but Cleveland was really unpopular for a number of reasons. One, because, you know, the country is in a depression, and we always kind of blame the president for that. Also, you know, his role in the Pullman strike, people weren't very excited about that. And also people remembered even back the day when he had taken that loan from J.P. Morgan. People still were kind of bitter about that. So the Democrats knew Cleveland was out. So going into the convention, it was really anybody's game, and it was a toss-up who's going to be the Democratic nominee. Well, that question was answered after a man by the name of William Jennings Bryan gives this very, very famous speech, and it's called the Cross of Gold speech. What Bryan really does is he preaches the populist gospel, the idea of increasing inflation by the coinage of silver. And Bryan was very energetic, very charismatic speaker. He was only 36 at the time, and he was, I believe, a representative from Nebraska. And he goes to, you know, during the convention, gives this speech to about 15,000 folks. And, you know, it's all about, you know, we should use silver to create inflation to help out farmers. And he's quoted by saying, quote, "You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify man upon a cross of gold." Well, this is a big sensation, makes a big splash at the convention, and the very next day, they actually nominate Bryan to be president with the platform of silver, okay? Silver for inflation, that's what they want. So let me kind of take a minute here to explain something. I keep saying that silver will lead to inflation, and let me just explain what I mean by that. There's nothing innately wrong with using silver as a way to back up your currency. There's nothing wrong with it. Really, what the problem was the value they wanted to put on silver. They wanted to value silver at about 2 times its market value. And that meant if you had a silver dollar, really, if you would go to sell that same silver on market, it would only be worth about 50 cents. So when they're backing silver, they're really backing an overvalued price of silver, which leads to inflation, because the value of then the legal tender would go really, really down, if that makes sense. Maybe it didn't, but inflation, that's what the farmers wanted. Anyway, so some Democrats, you know, who are pro-gold standard left the Democratic Party. And it also leaves the populists in this weird position because, you know, the populists were totally on board with Bryan. They wanted to see silver inflate the currency. So really for this election, they decide to also endorse Bryan. So we see Bryan being endorsed by both the Democrats and the Populist Party at this time. Section Q, class conflict. Plow holders, like farmers, versus bond holders, like the kind of established conservatives out east. So this is the 96 election still. Republicans originally wanted the tariff to be the main issue of the campaign, but Bryan came along and really forced the gold versus silver debate. So we see a lot of down and out Americans really seeing Bryan and his silver idea as kind of their messiah that would come and save them all. But on the same hand, the people out east, those conservatives, were in a panic. They would see their fortunes almost be cut in half overnight if the silver came to be, because their holdings in the East were not in land, their holdings were in paper currency, in bonds. So if they see an inflation, they see their fortune more or less becoming less and less valuable. So people out east were freaking out. So let's keep talking. People, Republicans, like with this fear, they tried their best to really campaign for McKinley, that Republican who kept the gold standard. A couple of different things they do is some Republican businesses made contracts contingent on the election. They said, I'll order this much cotton if McKinley wins. They also kind of went to their employees and said, hey, if Bryan wins this election, don't bother showing up on Wednesday. You're going to be out of a job, kind of intimidating them into voting for McKinley. And also they threatened to pay their workers in silver if Bryan were to win. So we see a lot of tactics here really promoting McKinley, really against Bryan. And also we see a lot of very wealthy people out east just pour fortunes into this election. McKinley is able to raise $16 million for this election, while Bryan only raises about $1 million. So we see really panicky people out east just pouring money into this election. Well, when it's all said and done, McKinley wins. He gets 271 electoral votes, and Bryan only gets 176. Yeah. Okay, and this victory is really, it's been set up as, the established conservatives out east that have all the money versus kind of the down and out workers and farmers. And we really see through this election that, just focusing on getting the farmers' vote isn't enough to win the White House. Okay, this section finally ends by talking about this election specifically. We see a shift in kind of the political history in America. What we see is the rise of something called the fourth party system. The fourth party system does not mean there are now 4 political parties. No. The party system is just how historians have kind of organized the political history of America. For example, the first party system was when we had the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. The second party system is when we had the Whigs and the Democrats. The third party system, the one we're now just kind of getting out of, is where we saw really the Democrats versus the Republicans, but it's like the Republicans are in the north and the Democrats are all in the south. And now we're shifting into this fourth party system, kind of shifting away from north versus south. Now we're really seeing this is a time where Republicans really kind of rule. For the next 36 years, out of those 36 years, only 8 years will we see a Democrat actually in the White House. And we also see kind of a shift of the major political issues. Up to this time, we've been talking about, money. Is it going to be gold? Is it going to be silver? We've been talking about kind of getting rid of the spoils system or civil service reform, that sort of thing. So now we're not really focusing on those. Now we're going to focus more on the, increasing of industrial regulation, labor concerns, that sort of thing. And while the Gilded Age, the third party system, if you will, was really known for really close elections, high voter turnouts, now after this election we really see people becoming less involved politically, lower political turnout, that sort of things. Really, Republicans are dominating. Why show up to vote at all? Okay, last section, section R, is entitled Republican Stand-Patism Enthroned. If you're curious, stand-patism is another word for just, resisting change. So this section is going to be talking about McKinley specifically and how a lot of these Republicans during this time are really going to be resistant to reform or to change. McKinley, he really kept his ear to the ground, which meant he was really aware of public opinion, and he never really stepped out of line. He stayed in line with public opinion for the most part. So that means he really didn't make many reforms. He also kind of let business be business. He didn't regulate them at all. They kind of had free reign. So we see the trusts during his presidency really even gaining more political power. Because this kind of gold versus silver debate was really settled when McKinley won the 96 election, he focuses now on the tariff. He wants a higher tariff. We're going through this depression and the federal government is running in the deficit, or we're losing money each year. So he wants to increase the tariff to get some more money for the federal government. And so he has passed the Dingley Tariff Bill. And this tariff bill, the Dingley Tariff Bill, is really a collection of about 850 different amendments or different kind of things attached to this one tariff bill. And in effect, it raises the average tariff rate to about 46.5%, which is nice and high. All right, this chapter finally ends by talking about, by 96, things were starting to turn around. The economy was rebounding from the Depression. Prices of crops were slowly over time increasing, and we actually see the much needed inflation those farmers were so desperate for actually happen through the gold standard. Let me explain. So 1900, the Gold Standard Act was passed, which means that you can redeem paper currency in gold. Gold had won. But what happened is, internationally, the supply of gold was increasing. We saw in South Africa, in Australia, in Canada, and Alaska, a lot of people were finding gold. So because there was an increase of the international gold supply, that naturally led to a nice moderate inflation, and that really helped the farmers out, and like I said, really helped kind of bring America out of this depression. And Republicans were more than, happy to take credit for that. All right, end of this chapter. Next chapter, similar time frame. We're moving up a little bit in time, and that'll be looking at kind of the foreign policy of America. We're going to be looking at Cuba, the Philippines, China, the Panama Canal, that sort of thing.